allergen task. There you go. Definitely recorded. So in terms of how we selected the topics for the session today, so we have a LinkedIn community of practice, and we basically asked the members of the community of practice the topics that they'd like us to cover today. So today we will be covering sampling and analysis and a number of case studies which are associated with the sampling and analysis. And I'm delighted to be joined by my co-contributors and an expert group members, so Dr. Michael Walker and Professor René Crevel. So before we start, I just wanted to do a very quick recap of the Quantitative Allergen Risk Assessment project. Another point of housekeeping, so if I could ask, we do have a Q&A session at the end today. So I would encourage participants to post their questions into the chat, and then there will be time that we've put aside at the end in order for our experts to answer the questions. Next slide, please. So this particular ILSI group was established back in 2020, which seems an awful long time ago now. And the overall intent of the expert group was to improve implementation of quantitative risk assessment where it was necessary, and to do it in such a way that it covered all elements of the food chain. The other reason that we set out on this journey was that we wanted to get to a point of consensus, of harmonization, so that, if you like, this could feed into decision making for the different elements that we've looked at. And in terms of the outputs, we had a number of things have come from this. So we had a peer-reviewed paper, we had the ILSI black and white, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And we also, as I've mentioned already, we do have a community of practice, which is on LinkedIn. So again, anybody on this call today who'd like to join the community of practice, where we do share a lot of information, I'm sure we'll be able to share the link with that later. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we conducted the project, so we split into 3 working groups, and that was across 2 distinct assessment categories. So we had proactive, where we assessed food production under normal operating conditions, both upstream and in-house. And then we had a section looking at how you might use QRA reactively. So if you were responding to an incident, an allergen-related incident. Next slide, please. So this is the paper. This is the black and white, both of which, so the paper is open access and the actual guidance document is free to download from the ILSI website. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of how we structured the black and white, so you've got a big section looking at supply chain. So what are the regulatory aspects? What kind of information do manufacturers need in order to do their own QRA? And how do we obtain that information in a standardized way? For management of operations, so we looked at how one might conduct a quantitative risk assessment, and we've backed this up with lots of different scenarios. We have a section looking at how to consider the cross-contact risks, and also a section, because clearly cleaning is an important allergen control within manufacturing. So there's a big section looking at that, how one might validate, verify, and monitor cleaning. We have a section on incidents, so what kind of information you would need to do a QRA, to respond to an incident. And then we have the core concepts, so looking at different scenarios of unintended allergen presence, looking at the amount of unintended allergen presence in food. We offer guidance on food intake, which is an important factor for doing the QRA, and also some of the basic calculations of how one might look at reference doses and action levels. And within the annexes, that's where we have our chapters on sampling and analysis, which we're going to cover today. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to pass over to Dr. Michael Walker, who's going to go through in some detail about sampling and analysis. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Simon. That was a great introduction. And I'm going to talk about the sampling and analysis section, mostly the sampling. Next slide, please. And these are my declarations of interest. I'll just let you walk through them for a second. Oh, there we go. And happy to answer any questions in the Q&A on my various activities. So next slide, please. And I'm going to talk about section 5.2 in the guidance. And this is a core concept section on the amount of unintended allergen presence in food. And it includes guidance and analysis on pages 86 to 103 and 109 to 115. And that's probably the most comprehensive, detailed analysis of the analysis that you'll find anywhere. And that was put together by Marianne van Ravenhorst, who's on the call in the panel today. And then the sampling is on pages 103 to 108. So if you look at the next slide, then we have set out in section 5.2.1 the overall plan, and the need for testing arises from risk assessment. And we've described the various aspects, including sampling. So if you hit the button, Geraldine, that'll be just highlight the sampling aspect, and right through to interpretation of text. So, yep, next slide. So this is to orientate you within the content section of the black and white. You can, it's all hyperlinked, so you can find allergen sampling analysis, click on that, and it'll take you straight through to where we want you to go. And our aims are to provide practical guidance because very little or none exists previously. And please tell us if you know there's anything out there that we've missed. You'll see our recommended reading at the end of my presentation. And next, what we want to do is prompt a harmonized and systematic approach to sampling. And next. And we want to prompt allocation of the required resources. In other words, we want to avoid unnecessary time, money, and effort spent when it's not needed. But what we suggest is that the guidance provides justification for expenditure of a high level of resource when the situation requires it. And that's essentially to prevent unsafe food on the market. And the corollary of that is to prevent reputational damage and costs to your business. Next, please. And will all of this solve all of the problems that you may encounter? Unlikely. But we hope that our guidance will be a good place to start for your own issues when they arise. Next. We start by looking at the types of sample, and there are two types, the finished product, prepared food, and the ingredients. And sampling and analysis of both of those types of sample gives a direct measure of the amount of allergen protein the consumer is exposed to. And also very important is looking at rinse waters, settle plates for dust and environmental swabs. And they give indirect measures. And all of these are discussed in pages 87 and 89 of the guidance. And I'll touch mainly on the first two. We're not looking at rinse water, settle plates, or environmental swabs today. But please let us know if you want another webinar around those issues. Next, please. A sample then is a small part or quantity intended to show what the whole is like. And if we imagine this brown blob is the consignment, and if the unintended allergen presence is uniformly distributed throughout the consignment, a sample anywhere will give you, on analysis, information about the whole consignment. But if we look at the next scenario, if the unintended allergen is distributed inhomogeneously in hotspots throughout the consignment, then we take two samples, we might get two different results, not detected and a positive presence. We take three on the next slide, we may get a different result again. And that's why multiple sampling is important when it's appropriate, and we'll talk about that when we come to it in the next slide. The key aspects are to maximize the possibility that if cross-contact has occurred and unintended allergen presence is there, that it will be present in a sample. And that depends on the timing, the frequency, the location, the numbers of samples taken, the size of the samples, and the treatment of the sample. And ultimately, I think there's a double transition here. Yeah, thanks, Geraldine. So ultimately, ideally, when allergen protein is not detected in a thorough sampling regime, it should not be expected in other routine situations. Next slide. And what we did was we developed a tiered approach to sampling, stratified that by the level of concern and applicable resources. And if you skip through low and then medium and high, we looked at these three scenarios. And in the next slide, we've got a description of where you might regard the concern and resource allocation as low. This is essentially where we're just looking at routine verification ingredients where you don't have a free-from claim, where the allergen presence occurs at a regular known frequency and there's an homogeneous distribution of allergen protein in the product. We'll come later to how you know these conditions pertain, but when they do pertain, then a single sample or a small number of samples should suffice to give you the information you require. And that may also then be a feature of this scenario that there's a low availability of material for sampling, or there's limited time or resource available to do the sampling and analysis. And the only caveat here then is that the sample size should be sufficient for laboratory purposes. And for that, you need to consult the laboratory. So simple conditions, known regular and homogeneous distribution, single sample or a small one. And the next slide then. Ramping up the concern a little bit, we're still looking at routine verification without a claim. And we're still looking at homogeneous distribution, but we may be looking at intermittent frequency of allergen presence or some inhomogeneity of allergen presence. Then we're hoping that there's sufficient or abundant material available to sample from or can be made to sample from, and that we're still got a limited amount of time and resource available, but that may escalate to urgent and more resources may be made available depending on circumstances. And so here we're saying at least two, preferably up to 6 samples, and especially if allergen presence may be intermittent, definitely 6 samples. And again, sample size is also important. Next slide, please. And then we're at the highest level of concern where quantification is needed for a risk assessment, a claim validation, or dealing with an incident. And in this instance, we may still be looking at allergen presence, which is regular and homogeneous. So we may default to the 6 samples or 2 from every batch. And then for a risk-based claim validation, there's some guidance out there from the UK Food and Drink Federation, which we can refer you to. But if the allergen presence is not regular and or not homogeneous, we need to take account of the size of the batch and apply some rules. And the rules will depend on the number of batch units available, or essentially incremental sampling from a bulk consignment. And that's explained in the next slide. And these are arbitrary rules, and they're designed to provide consistency and to give you guidance so that you're not having to spend time thinking, what am I going to do? How many samples will I take? Do I get it wrong? Too many, too few? And these arbitrary rules do not derive directly from sampling theory. Sampling theory is heavily statistical. They do have some literature attached to them. They have been assessed. They are widely used, but they're not theoretically underpinned. So what we imagine is that we're sampling from a large number of packaged units, or if we're looking at a bulk consignment, we can think of imaginary, arbitrarily defined notional units, cubes, geometrical shapes within the batch that we can randomly sample from. And then the two rules of thumb essentially are to take the square root plus one of the number of packaged units, or the number of arbitrary notional units, or to do the cube root. And that's easily explained if you take n, that is the number of packaged units, or the number of cubes or other geometrical shapes arbitrarily defined in the consignment. Say that number n is 10,000. So root n plus 1 is 101 samples. Cubed root is 22 samples. So we've got an immediately apparent stratification of what you would do. You would always do this, but we've got an alternative depending on the needs of the particular case. Do you take more or less samples? In the next slide, then, we'll see what we do with it. Because do we need to analyze all of them? Well, the answer is yes, if the way in which the concentration of unintended allergen presence varies across the batch, and that the way that it varies needs to be known. And that will typically be in a situation where you have no prior knowledge about the homogeneity, the regularity, the occurrence, and you need to build that knowledge up. Or you're in a high-profile, fast-moving incident where you don't really have time to do a look-see sample and then go back and do the sampling all over again. It has to be done right from the start. So if the answer to those is yes, the answer is yes, analyze all the samples. But if time is on our side and resource is constrained, and importantly, the method limited detection is adequate, then, actually that should be limited quantification because we're going to talk about quantified results. The LOQ is adequate, then we don't necessarily need to analyze all the samples. And the next slide gives us a good illustration of how that might work. So let's take the conditions where we have a critical concentration derived from allergen quantitative risk assessment. And that critical concentration, let's say, is 1.5 milligrams of total allergenic protein per kilogram of food. And that's represented by a sample with a red rather than blue dot. And the LOQ, the limit of quantification for the method, is known to be 0.1 milligrams of allergenic protein per kilogram. So on the left of the screen, we can see that all 22 samples have been taken and we analyze all of them. And if we do that, then we will find the sample in which there is allergen present. But that's 22 analyses, costly of time and money. In the middle, we've got the scenario where we composite all of the 22 samples, just homogenize it all together and do one analysis. And that then dilutes the one sample in which the allergen occurs. And if we consider that it might be at 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, it dilutes it down by 1.5 over 22 to something around 0.07 milligrams per kilogram. But that's below the limit of quantification of the method. And in that instance, we don't then have any useful information from this exercise because we haven't got a quantitative analysis that we can stand over. And it may appear to tell us that, for example, no PAL or no action is required, precautionary allergen label is required. But the analysis doesn't justify it because it doesn't give us any quantitative information because the amount we're looking for is below the LOQ. The way around that is then on the left, on the right of the screen, where we've divided the 22 samples into two sets of 11. And the first set, in the top of the box, they don't contain the allergen, at least not detectably, so that will be below LOQ, and we're happy with that. Then in the second set, where the red dot is, then that'll be this time 1.5 divided by 11, not 22, and that comes to 0.14. So that's a concentration where the method works. That's above the LOQ. So we will then have, if the answer comes up, nothing, less than LOQ in the first 11, 0.14 in the second, that's within the LOQ, within the working range of the method. This gives us concrete evidence that no action is necessary because it's below the critical concentration of 1.5. But the evidence is there, the methods worked, it should. We've got a conclusion justified by proper analysis. So how do we apply this more generally? Look at the next slide then. We can think of some so-called rules, and if you just work your way through this slide, Geraldine, I'll just put it all up now and through it then. Well, first of all, discuss it with the laboratory, because what you need to know is that the laboratory has a robust and well-characterized method LOQ. And what do I mean by robust and well-characterized? I mean that it's an LOQ derived from replicate analyses in the matrix by the method used by the laboratory. It's not an in-buffer LOQ that the method originator has come up with. It's an ELISA. It's not the ELISA company's validation in buffer of their own ELISA kit. It's the laboratory's LOQ validated with that method in that matrix. And if you've got that, then we can calculate how many samples that can be composited simply by the number n that can be composited is less than, significantly less than, the critical concentration divided by the robust LOQ. So looking from the previous example, the critical concentration was 1.5 milligrams per kilogram allergen protein, the LOQ was 0.1. So 1.5 over 0.1 gives us 15. So what do I mean by significantly below? We've got to remember that both those numbers, 1.5 and 0.1, have an uncertainty around them. And to look at the uncertainty of the critical concentration, you need to talk to the risk assessor. Because this might be an average, it might be the worst case scenario. You need to know. Again, you need to know the standard deviation around the LOQ. And you still may be puzzled about what actual number you're going to take. And my advice would be to go for 20 and preferably 30% of the number. So 30% of 1.5 is 4. 30% of 15 is 4.5. We're looking at a number and significantly below 15, or around 10.5, 11, coherent with our previous example. What you do then is you thoroughly homogenize each of the samples that you've taken, the 22 samples, and take half from each sample and combine that half with the appropriate number of other halves to form the composite, the two sets of 11. But you retain the remaining half sample in the event that you have to go back and analyze them individually or use a different combination. So say the lab comes back and say, well, actually in your matrix, our LOQ is not 0.1, it's something higher. You may want to go back and use a different LOQ, a different number of samples to composite, and you've got them there because you've preserved half of each individual sample. So next slide. Oh yes, did I mention discuss with the laboratory? Cannot be said too much. Discuss with the laboratory. Next slide, please. Coming back to the question I posed earlier on, how do I know if the unintended allergen presence is regular and homogeneous? Well, the first thing is, can you make any reasonable assumption? based on previous experience? Or is it possible to describe a worst case scenario? For example, in a dry powder product produced in a batch process, the highest level of carryover might be in the first 50 to 100 kilograms, and that's where most of the samples should be collected. Whereas if you're producing the bulk batch by repeated mixing, the UAP will be more likely to be distributed throughout the final product, and random sampling might be more appropriate. You can also gain information over time to modify the sampling approach, for example, by increasing the raw material testing and decreasing the numbers of end products tested, or the other way around. So you need to know and keep records and do trend analysis. Next slide. And the nature of the process and the nature of the allergen might also help, because the distribution of unintended allergen presence can be influenced by the form of the product. In a finely ground powder, you might expect homogeneity, unless there's stratification, the powder sits in a silo for a period. The product may be a paste, and then the desired organoleptic product, the organoleptic characteristics might dictate whether the paste is highly homogenized before its retail sale, or it remains a chunky, inhomogeneous texture. Might be a ready meal when you've got entirely different foods in the same retail unit. The nuts might be whole or segmented, fragmented. We discussed single batch versus continuous flow. Another example is that multiple depositor heads may occasion completely random deposition of hang-ups from the heads. And similarly with heat exchange columns, there may be randomly redistributed adherent product at the business end of the heat exchange. And then, of course, known problems with suppliers or in the production process. If you trend analysis those, then that can dictate where you focus your sampling. And finished or semi-finished products in the production facility often allows targeted sampling, and that may allow you to reduce the number of end product samples or retail samples that you take. So there's a lot of work you can do behind the scenes. And the next slide then is, can you do any more? And I want to emphasize the dialogue with the laboratory. They know the analysis, you know the product, and educating one another is key. And this is best done in a quiet situation where nothing is going on. In an incident, when an incident develops, tensions rise, people may become defensive, communication suffers. So do it in peacetime rather than in wartime. And there may be things the laboratory can do to focus in on more robust data produced for your use. You might increase the laboratory samples, even up to something heroic like 5 kilograms. That would cause the lab a bit of a hassle to homogenize, store, but you can see from the diagrams we had earlier, that gives you much more chance of capturing the unintended allergen presence randomly distributed. You can also then increase the number of samples sent to the lab. You might want to do that on a precautionary basis in a high concern problematic situation. But within the laboratory, the lab itself can increase the test portion size. Now that depends on the method. If you're using PCR or LC-MS, you may be only able to analyze milligram size test portions, whereas ELISA can cope with 5, 10 grams very easily. And obviously, when you're talking about a 5 kilogram sample, taking 1 or 2 milligrams out of it is not particularly representative. So you could, if you're constrained, PCR, LC-MS to milligram samples, then you should do more full replicate test portions. That'll cost more, but it'll be more robust in terms of the results you get. And where do we get these numbers from? They're from 2 lovely papers by Sharma et al. On the evaluation of the measurement of gluten in oat groats. And those papers were written by a study team that included Thomas Whittaker, who is a past master on operating characteristic curves. He did all the work on mycotoxin sampling. And Paul Welling, a very experienced statistician. So have a look at those papers. Next slide. We've collected some good other guidance. I've got about 40 seconds left. I'm nearly finished. Um, Allergen Bureau has excellent guidance on the sampling of agricultural commodities. And these two other bits of guidance, good samples and good test portions, are well worth a read. And all of this is free and open access. Next slide. And lastly, almost lastly, there are a couple of annexes in the guidance, in our own guidance, on planning and recording. So all that I've talked about is condensed. This is one of Neil Buck's famous flow charts. This is all condensed in a flow chart, and it walks you through everything I've been saying so that you can think about and plan. And this is great stuff for your team in, oh, there's my time up. And in the guidance, you'll find the flow chart, and you'll also find a pro forma. So if we show the next slide, and this, when you're on the landing page for the guidance, you can download lots of stuff as well. And there's a sampling analysis form. It looks a bit like what you can see on the right of the screen. There's a couple of pages to it that even gives you a simple algorithm to work out the strength of evidence. But this is a way that you can be sure you're recording everything you need. So that's me. Next slide just says thank you. But in conclusion, I hope we've provided practical guidance. Let us know if there's anything we've missed. Please use it for a harmonized and systematic approach to your sampling and analysis. Please use it to allocate the required resources to sampling, and use it especially if you know you need more resources. This will provide the justification. Use it to dialogue with your laboratory. And remember, it's not going to solve all your problems, but we hope it's a starting point for you when the issues arise in your allergen problem in your business. Thanks very much for listening. Back to
Thank you,
Simon.
Michael. Yes, back to me very briefly. So I was just going to encourage you, if you've not posted any questions in the chat, if you could do so, but without further ado, I'll pass on to Professor René Crevel. René, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, thank you first of all, actually, Michael, for great presentation actually on the principles and practice of sampling and to some extent analysis. There's great. I'm going to talk about a number of case studies which actually in the guidance document, and I'm just going to say those while they're based on real experiences, they are not the companies mentioned are fictional companies actually. So there's no we've not actually shared any data that shouldn't be shared there. So next slide, please. Okay, my declaration of interest there. We can pass that on now. Okay, so the first case study actually is a company which manufactures pasta, and in this particular case, including ravioli, which are both egg-containing and egg-free. And they make the components of that ravioli on their production site, so they don't have to worry about some of the suppliers, at least in that particular respect. Their products are sold exclusively in the European Union, so basically this is to say that the European Union list of allergenic foods is the one that applies here and that is managed. And see there, they've determined that that cross-contact is not reasonably likely to occur with a number of those particular allergens, which is listed there, which you can read at your leisure. But other allergenic foods, including eggs, sesame, milk, including lactose, and fish, may occur in the processing facility, either as cross-contact with supplied ingredients, but also as cross-contact residues. And the assessment in this particular case is going to look at the case of eggs, actually. So what the company wishes to do here is to explore the use of quantitative risk assessment to see if precautionary allergen labeling for egg is actually needed. So we can go to the next slide now. Right, okay, you should see there what the line flow diagram of unit operations looks like for that particular process, the manufacture of ravioli. And you can see there, I think if you can read it, that the equipment which is in contact with egg, either through cross contact or through because it's added to the product, actually is highlighted in the yellow colored boxes. And that's the convention we'll use in all the other case studies as well, just so that you know. Move to the next slide. Oops. Right, now the first thing one needs to do actually when considering sampling for any particular purpose is where is it most appropriate, where does UAP, unintended allergen presence, occur? Because there's clearly no point in actually generating samples where there's no likelihood of the allergen being present at all, where it's not even present. And you can see most areas there are actually covered, but a couple of storage areas are not wouldn't be appropriate for sampling because the egg product or the egg product in containers doesn't actually go anywhere near there. So it's basically segregation there. And you can see for the other areas what the cross-contact risk is, because that cross-contact risk actually feeds into the next slide, into the next, next slide, please. Whoops. Okay, right. Oops, no, go back. Yes, which actually describes the next step. And because having established where it occurs, you need to assess the likelihood that an intended allergen's presence occurs. And there are some of those areas where clearly it is not very likely. And as you can see here, there are a number of areas ranging from receiving and the various storage areas, including the non-refrigerated storage area, actually, where the allergen is, where the eggs are stored until they are used, where cross-contact is actually considered unlikely. And all the other areas is where it is, and you can see that a quantitative assessment can be made in many cases of the presence, because those are actually unit operations which involve mixing, dropping, shaping, cutting, and various ways of handling the ravioli material. Okay, we can go on to the next one now. Next slide, please. Right. Following that, actually, you also want to know what the characteristics of the hazard of the cross contact at each particular point are, because you need to determine ultimately the risk that they pose to consumers who are susceptible to reacting to any of the components of that product, actually. And some of the factors influencing this risk, the main factors influencing this risk include obviously the allergen protein concentration, the physical form of the allergen, whether it's homogeneous or particulate, and the amount or product or ingredient which is likely to contribute to the cross contact. Now, in this particular case, I haven't mentioned it, but I think you may well have worked it out. The form of cross contact of the physical form of the allergen is homogeneous, actually, and it is, yes, there is a mixing stage which actually ensures that anything that is present in the that is present actually is thoroughly mixed, actually, as well. So you can assume a even distribution throughout. We can move on to the next, please. And this is, once you've done that particular assessment, you can start identifying the points where the concentration, where there's a high probability or a lower probability or an intermediate probability of the of cross contact occurring, and those would be the priorities, the priority points for sampling. Now, as you can see in the little box at the bottom, if you actually looking at a well-characterized process and one which you know very well, you may be able to avoid taking as many samples, and you can sample the ones which are noted by an arrow there, actually, which are three particular points: the filling, pasteurization, and then the packaging. But yes, as noted, if you actually were to only to have a positive under those circumstances in the packaging, you would have to go back and wonder and consider and investigate to find out what has possibly gone wrong with your process, actually, and result, because you can't be sure at that particular stage whether that presence is actually significant or not, and you cannot make a proper quantitative risk assessment based on those results. If we move on to the next slide. Yes, so this is just looking at the quality of evidence for quantitative risk assessment. It might seem, yes, obviously, it might seem fairly obvious, actually, if you're talking about quantitative risk assessment, that you need quantitative data, but it's worth going through the various points there. There are a number of prerequisites which are qualitative, but which provide qualitative data, but which obviously clearly not sufficient for evidence for quantitative risk assessment and cannot form the basis. There are some semi-quantitative elements like swabbing the equipment and so on, which provide some indication but are not conclusive. And ultimately, actually, in a process like this, if you're thinking about validation or even verification, you would be looking for the absence of the offending allergenic food, or the presence at least below the reference dose, within a following product which does not contain the allergen, so egg in this particular case. So that would be the input. So analytical data and those circumstances would be the evidence that you would require for the quantitative risk assessment.
No, thank you.
Oh, next slide, please. Then they've got that one on there.
Could everyone go on mute, please? Sorry, Rennie. Could everyone go on mute?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, some interesting comments there. Yeah. Okay, so the next case study actually is different in terms of the allergen. Again, we've got in this particular case we're looking at the case of sesame in a bakery. So sesame in this particular case is both an ingredient and the possible cross-contact agent, because as you can see there, this company, Best Bakes, makes bread and bread rolls, and they make both plain and seeded rolls. And some of the seeds that they use are sesame seeds. Again, products sold exclusively in the European Union. And they've determined that cross-contact with soy, nuts, milk, wheat, and barley is not reasonably expected to occur. But they found that sesame may occur in the processing facility either as an ingredient, well, yes, it's the seeded roll, or as cross-contact residues. And that's what the assessment is going to focus on. Now, quite clearly in this example, sesame occurs as seeds. I mean, there are other forms of sesame, like sesame flour and so on, but this is not the case here. So cross-contact is particulate in nature. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we see again a diagram of the unit processes within this particular operation. And again, indicated in yellow, places where cross-contact could occur. It's not necessarily does occur, but could occur because of the sesame seeds in some form occur there. So, right, we can move to the next slide. Okay. So taking through the same process as showed for the preceding example, you look first of all where UAP may occur, and yes, it can occur. It can. There are some areas where it can't occur. Yes, because clearly the sesame seed is segregated away from those areas, not stored in those particular areas. But otherwise, there are quite a few areas there, mostly in the processing part, in the product preparation part, where cross-contact may occur, but also there is a theoretical possibility of cross-contact, for instance, in the receiving area and in the non-refrigerated storage as well, where the sesame seeds containers are kept. Next slide, please. And again, so you recognize this sort of diagram by now. You can see that, again, those receiving areas and the storage areas where the sesame seeds are not dispersed within the environment, not according to good practice at least, the chance, although there's a possibility of cross-contact, a theoretical possibility, its occurrence is very unlikely. So most of the cross-contact in this particular case occurs mostly within all the manufacturing operations, surprisingly, there. And what you can see when you look at the controls for those, I mean, obviously for the where it's absent, actually, the control is essentially a segregation or type. But for most of the manufacturing operations, it is cleaning of the mix of the equipment all the way through, in fact. Now we can move on from that. Next slide, please. And again, we can modify the flow, the unit operations flow diagram that I showed earlier on, and identify some areas where it is where the probability is high, medium, or low. Yes, there is one particular low one, the non-refrigerated storage we'd already seen, because of the segregation and because the sesame seeds are not removed from their containers at that particular point. You might be surprised that the weighing, mixing, kneading, and forming is medium rather than high, but as you will there, actually the sesame seeds actually added after that particular process. So they should not be present in too large numbers there, but that's why proofing is much higher, and so on. So, okay, we can move on from that one. And again, looking at the quality of evidence, the quantitative risk assessment. Again, we are talking about quantitative risk assessment, so we want quantitative data. Now, in the case of this particular particulate allergen, it's not very useful to just send samples to a lab and ask for an ILSI analysis, for instance, because we are talking here about seeds. And actually, even if they were to detect any presence in a particular sample that was sent, it would not necessarily be a good representation of the presence of sesame and the likely presence of sesame in the final product. So make note here that the QRA metric in the case of particulate cross-contact will depend on the nature of the particulate. And for sesame seeds, which are very distinct, it will be frequency in the finished or semi-finished product, rather than an analytical measurement of concentration in the product. Quite clearly, that's quite demanding, and I'm not. I haven't suggested how that might be done in this particular case, but bear that in mind. There are some. There is another example actually in the guidance actually, which shows how that process was approached, where it was possible to actually separate the potential particulate matter, actually, elements from the bulk of the material. But that's because it was a frozen product. We can move on to the next now. Yes, so here we've got another homogeneous type, but slightly different from the first one, because we've got here a case of pasteurized fruit juices, and at the production site for this company, they have two SKUs that have a milk-derived ingredient, and are made on the same equipment as all the pasteurized fruit juices, which do not contain milk as an ingredient. Sorry. And after careful assessment, the HACCP team has found that there is a risk that cross-contact with milk may occur as cross-contact residues in the equipment. And the further assessment focuses on milk as an example. Now, the assessment also indicates that because of the nature of the operations, the cross-contact is homogeneous, and we can move on to the next to see the unit operations. Again, the usual, you can see, oops, no, don't move. Yes, no, not yet. Go back, please. Yeah, that's it. Yes, you can see the unit operations actually, all the unit operations effectively, apart from storage of chilled raw materials and obviously storage of bottles and packaging, actually involve a possibility, a theoretical possibility at least, of cross-contact with the milk ingredient. So we can move on to the next slide. Yes. So going through the process again, assessing where unintended allergen presence may occur, we can see that, yeah, there are some where it won't occur because basically the material is the milk ingredient. Milk-containing ingredient is segregated away from that. It's in a separate storage. And clearly after the product is packed, actually, cross-contact is no longer possible anyway. So again, it's not there. But otherwise, all the other operations, there is a possibility. Okay, so we move on to the next, please. Next slide, please. And you see the now familiar table, which shows that effectively that the probability, the cross-contact is highly probable during certain unit operations, basically the mixing, the pasteurization, and the filler. And after that, there is no. And of course, we can obtain quantitative data on those elements, on the unintended allergen presence for those. And again, the situation here is that sanitation is the key control again. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. And again, the familiar diagram. So yes, there is a high probability of cross-contact at those three stages from the mixing tank, pasteurizer, and to the filler, which are effectively included in the clean in place loop. So that's it. So, right, we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, and again, there are numbers of ways. I don't need to reiterate what I've already said there about that, but yeah, clearly you can analyze the following product to verify absence of the the potential cross-contact allergen, the milk, in a non-milk containing fruit juice, and then you've also got defined systems parameters post-validation, which actually demonstrate that the cleaning in place process actually has worked. Okay, I think, yeah, next slide, please. Oh, it's yes. So I think one key message I would like to pass on this actually is that the first principle actually when approaching these sort of issues actually is to know your own line, your own equipment, your own factory actually. because that is the only way you can actually ensure that you can produce that you actually have valid results and you can produce safe product.
Perfect. Thank you, Renee. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So that brings us, I don't think we've got any questions in the chat. So would anybody like to come off mute and ask a question? I did have a question. So my first question is for Michael. So you mentioned, I think, at least 4 times about the dialogue that you have with the laboratory. So what kind of questions do you need to be asking to build that level of confidence? Or if you're buying commercial kits, what kind of questions do you need to be asking of the kit manufacturer, Michael?
Okay. Well, first of all, can I mention there's a good Institute of Food Science and Technology guidance on how to instruct a laboratory. And if you go onto the IFST website, you'll see a suite of laboratory operations information statements. If you go into resources, there's a whole lot of information there, and I'm on the scientific committee, so I wrote some of it. So it's going to be good. So if I can remember what I wrote in that occasion, the first thing you may want to talk about is the method accredited to ISO 17025. And a good laboratory offering its service will generally have accreditation for the tests they're offering. They don't explicitly need to have accreditation for your matrix by the method you want, but they've got flexible scope for ELISA, then that gives them the opportunity to have an accredited method for a new allergen with a new test kit, provided they do the validation themselves. So accreditation is the first thing. As part of accredited status, you must do proficiency testing. You must participate in proficiency testing. So that'll be something you might want to discuss with them. Have you seen any problems? Do you do trend analysis of your laboratory results and PT schemes? And then you want to drill down into the performance characteristics of the method. And so the sorts of conversation you would be having would be, okay, you've given me a price, £50 for an allergen determination. What if you find the result is greater than the highest concentration in your accredited, validated range of concentrations that your method applies to? What do you do then? Do you give me an answer greater than 10, greater than 100 milligrams per kilogram of protein? And the lab will say, well, that's what we'll do, because if we want to do, we've got to actually give you a number. We need to do dilutions and another run, and we're going to charge you for it. And then you have the decision to make. Well, do I say, look, I need an actual result, not a greater than. If it takes more work, we will pay you. So that's a conversation to have at the start. And similar things with LOQs, LODs. What are they? Are they in the actual matrix? And the lab may well say, well, look, you've sent us a new matrix. We need to validate that. Are you going to cover some of the cost of that? Are you going to fund some of our work to give you the opportunity to give you the customer good results? And you'll say, well, I have no budget for that. Can you do your best? And the lab will say, okay, but you realize the LOQ may not be particularly relevant. Let's work on it. And you have that conversation with the laboratory. Again, you've got a high profile incident taking place. You've got a whole heap of samples coming in. You want to talk to the lab about, if that happens, can you put extra resource? Are your operations scalable? So that if I need to send, normally I send you 2 samples a month. That's not enough to keep the printer ink in my office. But suddenly I want to send you 200 samples. How are you going to cope with that? And the lab may say, look, it's impossible. Or the lab may say, yeah, we can bring in extra, we can give overtime, we can work at weekends. It's going to cost. So those sorts of conversations will be vital in dealing swiftly and confidently with a problem situation when it arises. Is that
Yeah, it
something
certainly
that
does.
helps?
The excellent guidance, I'm sure, Richard, is that free of charge to download?
Freely, yeah, freely downloadable, absolutely. And it talks about performance characteristics, what they mean, how you derive them, that sort of thing.
Perfect.
If you can't find it out there, guys, ping an email to Geraldine and I'll send you a link. In fact, I'll send the link to Geraldine so she knows.
Perfect. So we have a question from Richard, and I believe we also have some questions on LinkedIn. So Richard, if you'd like to go first. If you can find the button to bring you off mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, apologies for that.
No problem.
You would have thought by now I would have got it right. Yeah, a general point first of all, then just raise a couple of points really. Just fantastic to have a conversation about sampling and an analysis. In my book, I would say it should be a fundamental part of any of these GFSI standards to have a training module on this for appropriate staff. So fantastic. Just a couple of points I wanted to raise one was about composite samples. I believe many of us are present today are also present on the MFAN meetings. And at that meeting, we've talked about composite samples and have steered away from recommending them. So it's that sort of context of how do we get the same message coming out of the different groups. And the other point was about the difficulties with LOQs, just starting with definitions, and some manufacturers will use limits of detection when they talk about LOQs. We all know the other problems of reporting units. So it's quite a complex area just to get everything lined up. So just like to hear your thoughts on those a bit more. Thank you.
Renee, Michael, who'd like to go first?
Yeah, maybe I'll chip in first. I know what you're saying about composites, and the danger is you dilute out the positive finding, as we mentioned. On the other hand, we know it goes on. We know resources are stretched. We know it happens. It's better not to ignore that it happens and to try and harmonize and systematize. If you're going to do it, these are the rules, and that's that's what prompted that kind of advice within the guidance. We know that resources are not infinite. So I hope that addresses the issue. The other thing I ought to say is that Marianne, who's on the call, has a lot of experience in working with laboratories and may be able to comment as well on those aspects.
Marianne?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think the part of the question of Richard I can answer is regarding the wording used for LOD, LOQ, or upper limit of quantification. Yeah, it's my experience as well that it's often confusing. LOQ is often used also for the upper limit of quantification and for the lower limit of quantification, which is quite confusing. Yeah, and like Michael told, when there is a result above the upper limit of quantification, you need a dilution to get in the range of quantification. So there's a lot of fuss and discussion going on, and I would suggest to have a clear wording on those limits. And as far as I know, there is no wording for the upper limit of quantification. But saying this, it might be this simple as that, the upper limit of quantification. But I'm also wondering what your thoughts about this wording are, this confusion.
is that back to me?
Yeah,
oh,
it
sorry.
is.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, why not? Yeah, I mean, as a company in the companies I've worked for, I mean, we've always tried to differentiate LOD and LOQ, but I think, you know, we've tried to use LOQ as a more embracing term to define both the lower and the upper. But I'm aware that other people do use it in different contexts. I mean, I think, you know, the recent work, which again, a lot of people on this group have been part of AOAC, it's, you know, that's helped to define. And within this document, you know, these terms are defined. I guess it's part of an education process. And, you know, you deal with the industry where a lot of people aren't so familiar with these terms, and they're not so familiar for looking out to see how companies have defined the terms. So, you know, yeah, I think I'm sort of trying to get to the point of, you know, how do we transfer and help the people who don't have the time, really, industry people, to focus on these topics, really understand these things, and it's trying to make the messages clear, as sharp as we can, which is a really difficult task.
Brilliant. So we do have another question. Well, I think it's more of a comment. So Steve Gendel, who's on LinkedIn at the moment. So it says, I think that it's important to mention that QRA should be used after every effort is made to have an effective allergen control system in place. So QRA should never be used to justify less effort. And I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, it is, you know, we do everything which is reasonable and practicable to, you know, manage allergens, to avoid cross contact, but the QRA is a very useful tool. You know, once you have those, you know, your prerequisites, your GMPs in place, and you can start to look at this using hazard risk analysis. Renee, Michael, anything to add?
No. You see, I put basically the same comment in the chat, actually, but I did a proviso to that, actually, that I have met people actually who don't seem to understand some of those points. I mean, I remember some years back being asked, well, would we analyze some samples? It was not a CRP process. Yeah, I think it was a CRP process, and they were turbid, actually, and milk had been in the process. So, I mean, if you want to waste your money, you can do it there. But yeah, it's incredible. One cannot exclude that sort of situation.
Okay, perfect.
Do we have I don't mind
Go ahead.
I don't mind if people pay me to tell them the bleeding obvious. But it's a good example of how you can save money. The other dialogue I suppose we should talk about is between the laboratory, the three-way dialogue, the laboratory, the customer, and the risk assessor. And I give you an example. When Ben Remington and I were talking, I talked about an RM, and he said, "What do you mean by RM?" And I said, "I mean reference material." Oh, he says, "I mean risk manager." So we speak a different language, and so that's I think one of the key functions that ILSI can do with webinars like this is to provoke the sort of dialogue that we've just had about LOQs and LODs and performance characteristics, is to make, and that's the LinkedIn community of practice can help here too. We really should be able to talk to each other with the same vocabulary and same lexicon, or at least know what we're meaning, and that's, I think, what our 180, 190 pages of guidance. It's not meant to be read from beginning to end, but to be dipped into. But that's a really good place to start if we want to understand each other's language.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the group here or the group on LinkedIn? Geraldine, are there any more questions on LinkedIn?
Not right now, Simon. There are people following. There are 34 people following on LinkedIn Live, but they don't have any questions or comments?
Okay, so I've got another question. I think this one's for Renee. So you mentioned of the sesame example, and I thought that was a really good example.
Shut the links. I like to shut everything down and start again because I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Hi, Adrian. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned the sesame example, and actually, it's probably better to do a more detailed visual examination than it is, to do analysis.
Yeah.
What would you recommend if you let's imagine you had kind of amorphous clumping of product, if you like. So it's not truly heterogeneous and it's not truly homogeneous. What sort of sampling principles would you apply there?
Very well. I would assume actually it's more for the homogeneous, homogeneous type, and with a view to analysis. I'm thinking about some of the examples that we've got in the in the guidance actually, with a very thorough homogenization of that. But yes, it's a complicated one actually. That's one to do. Particulate, in fact, it's more in some ways more complicated than the particulate, where there's a well-defined particle which is unlikely to be smashed to pieces and evenly distributed within a sample, I would say.
Yeah.
So you've got an interesting thing. So it is well. I suppose the first thing actually is knowing that it occurs under those circumstances in the product, because probably I would think that may also pose issues from the point of view of the other properties of the product. I mean, in terms of consumer acceptance, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you don't want normally a product with clumpy bits unless it's designed to be that way.
Is that where trend analysis of consumer complaints is important?
That certainly would be, yeah.
Because you've got a whole, whole stack of complaints about a particular, so you see the complaints spiking of this is horribly clumpy stuff. It's not what I expected. Then it should start ringing alarm bells.
It certainly should. That's a very good idea, actually. Yes, to make more use of some of those resources, because the problem is about silos within companies. You've got different groups looking at one set of things, and others. Actually, it might even be that the consumer complaints go to an external agency and then are reported back to the company, and the company may not deal with them in that particular way. I don't know. I can imagine that.
It's in the public domain, so I'm not breaking any confidence, but Pret knew there were various occasions of the near miss that unfortunately Natasha Edmund-Laprose died from was known to have occurred prior to that, to the actual fatality.
Exactly. And it is strange that they did not actually act on that one, actually, at least not certainly not sufficiently anyway.
So it's an object list.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've put the IFST information statements link in the chat, and I've sent it to Geraldine. So
perfect. Thank you, Michael. Right, so we are 15 minutes from closing. So what I would suggest, if there are no more questions coming through, so I'd like to say a massive thank you to Dr. Michael Walker for taking us through the thorny issue of sampling and analysis. And I'd also like to thank Professor Renee Cravell for really being able to put these, sampling in a practical context, because often it's difficult to make that link. So thank you both. Excellent session today. Thank you, Geraldine and the ILSI team, for keeping us true and organized. And thank you for everybody who's been able to join the session. A very last plug. We will be sharing the community of practice. Great place. It's where we put a lot of the resources. It's where we advertise events, and I expect for our next webinar series, we'll be going back to the community of practice just to see if there's any additional or specific topics that we'd like to cover next time. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day.
Okay.
Thank you
All the
all.
best. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right. Thank you so much.